Barron Trump helps a homeless veteran. Story makes Secret Service agent cry. The January wind howled through Manhattan's concrete canyons, turning Fifth Avenue into a wind tunnel of swirling newspapers and hurrying pedestrians. Steam rose from manholes like ghostly fingers reaching for the steel-gray sky. While the morning crowd rushed past, each person wrapped in their own private world of wool coats and cashmere scarves. Barron Trump stood in line at his mother's favorite coffee shop, La Maison du Café, trying his best to seem inconspicuous despite his 6'7" frame. At 17, he'd grown used to the sideways glances and whispered conversations that followed him everywhere, but that didn't make them any easier to bear. "The usual, Mr. Trump?" Sarah, the barista, asked with a warm smile. She was one of the few people who treated him like any other regular customer. "Yes, please. And can I get a hot chocolate too?" He glanced at the Secret Service agents positioned discreetly near the door. "Make that 2 hot chocolates." Agent Steve Morrison, the lead agent on duty, suppressed a small smile. In the 3 years he'd been assigned to Barron's detail, the young man had never failed to think of his protection team during cold weather shifts. "You know we're not supposed to accept anything while on duty, sir," Morrison said, maintaining his professional demeanor. Barron raised an eyebrow. "And you know it's freezing out there, Agent Morrison. Consider it a security measure. Can't have you getting hypothermia on my account." The older agent shook his head slightly, but his eyes crinkled at the corners. It was hard to maintain strict protocol with someone who'd grown from a quiet 12-year-old into a thoughtful young man before his eyes. As Sarah prepared the drinks, Barron leaned against the counter, scrolling through messages on his phone. A text from his mother reminded him about tomorrow's charity board meeting. Another from his father asked if he'd seen the latest polls. He responded to both with brief acknowledgments, then opened his school's online portal to check on his latest assignments. "Your drinks, Mr. Trump," Sarah said, placing them in a carrier. "Stay warm out there." "Thanks, Sarah. See you tomorrow." He picked up the carrier and headed for the door, where Agent Morrison and Agent Chen fell into their usual positions, one slightly ahead, one behind. Outside, the wind had picked up, and the temperature seemed to have dropped another 10 degrees. Barron pulled his scarf tighter with his free hand and started the familiar walk back to Trump Tower. The route was well practiced, security cleared, and usually uneventful. "Storm's coming in," Agent Chen commented, his eyes constantly scanning the street. "Weather service says we might get 8 inches by tonight." "Great," Barron muttered. Another day stuck inside. He'd grown to hate snow days in the city. They meant increased security concerns, which translated to being confined to the tower. Sometimes he missed the relative freedom of his younger years in Washington, where the White House grounds at least gave him room to roam. They passed the usual landmarks, the high-end boutiques with their perfectly arranged window displays, the stern-faced doormen in their heavy wool coats, the endless stream of yellow taxis splashing through the slush. Barron found himself counting the blocks, as he often did, marking the distance to home. A group of tourists stopped suddenly in front of them to take selfies, forcing their small party to adjust their path. Agent Morrison smoothly guided them toward the inner part of the sidewalk, maintaining their protective formation while avoiding any obvious disruption. "Sorry about that," Barron said, knowing how much his security team disliked unexpected changes to their route. "All part of the job, sir," Morrison replied, but Barron caught the slight tension in his voice. Every deviation from routine meant new variables to assess, new potential threats to evaluate. They were passing a row of smaller shops, most of them still closed at this early hour, when Barron noticed something different. In the recessed doorway of what had once been an upscale boutique, someone had set up a makeshift shelter using flattened cardboard boxes and a tattered blue tarp. This wasn't unusual in itself. Despite the city's efforts, homelessness remained a persistent reality in Manhattan. What caught Barron's attention was the movement he saw beneath the tarp. Someone was shaking, but not in the usual way people shivered from cold. He slowed his pace slightly, trying to get a better look without being obvious about it. Agent Morrison noticed immediately. "Sir, we should keep moving," he said quietly, following standard protocol for any unplanned stops. But something about the figure in the doorway held Barron's attention. As they drew closer, he could see it was a man, probably in his 40s, wearing what looked like an old military jacket. His hands were trembling violently as he tried to hold on to a paper coffee cup someone had given him. The cup wobbled precariously, spilling hot liquid onto the man's already stained jeans. "Damn it," the veteran muttered, his voice shaking as badly as his hands. "Damn it, damn it, damn it." Barron found himself slowing to a complete stop, the hot chocolates in his carrier suddenly feeling heavy in his hand. The man hadn't noticed them yet, too focused on trying to control his trembling hands. Up close, Barron could see that the shaking wasn't from the cold, at least not entirely. He recognized the signs of a panic attack, having experienced them himself during the most intense periods of public scrutiny in his early teens. The veteran's breathing was becoming increasingly labored, each exhale creating small clouds in the frigid air. His eyes were squeezed shut, and beads of sweat dotted his forehead despite the bitter cold. "Sir," Agent Morrison said more firmly this time, "we need to keep moving." But Barron couldn't move. He stood transfixed, watching as the man's trembling intensified. The coffee cup slipped from his grasp, spilling its remaining contents across the frozen concrete. "No, no, no," the veteran mumbled, his voice thick with frustration and something deeper, despair. He tried to reach for the fallen cup, but his hands were shaking too badly to grasp it. That's when he finally looked up, perhaps sensing the presence of others. His eyes met Barron's, and in that moment, something passed between them, a recognition that went beyond their obvious differences in circumstances. The veteran's eyes held a haunted look, one that Barron had seen before in photographs his father had shown him during visits to Walter Reed Hospital. It was the look of someone fighting battles long after leaving the battlefield. The man quickly averted his gaze, as if ashamed to be seen in his current state. His breathing became more erratic, and his whole body seemed to curl in on itself, trying to become invisible. "He's having a panic attack," Barron said softly, still not moving from his spot. Agent Morrison and Agent Chen exchanged quick glances, their training warring with the obvious distress of the man before them. They'd been briefed about their protectee's own history with anxiety, which made this situation even more delicate. Without warning, Barron took a step toward the doorway. The agents reacted instantly, adjusting their positions to maintain their protective formation while simultaneously assessing the new variables this situation presented. "Sir," Agent Morrison started, but something in Barron's expression made him pause. The winter wind whipped around them, carrying with it the sounds of the city, car horns, distant sirens, the endless symphony of New York life. But in that recessed doorway, time seemed to slow down. The veteran's ragged breathing cut through the ambient noise like a distress signal, one that Barron found impossible to ignore. He took another step forward, still holding the drink carrier with its now cooling hot chocolates. The man in the doorway had begun to rock slightly, a self-soothing motion that Barron recognized all too well. The military jacket, despite its wear, still bore traces of its original dignity, patches that spoke of service and sacrifice, now witnessed only by indifferent passers-by. This was the moment that would change everything, though none of them knew it yet. In the years to come, they would all look back on this cold January morning and recognize it as a turning point. But for now, it was simply a moment of choice, to walk past like hundreds of others had done, or to stop and acknowledge another human being's pain. The Secret Service agents tensed as Barron took one more step toward the doorway. The protocol for such situations was clear, but something about this moment defied standard operating procedure. They watched as their young charge, the son of one of the most controversial figures in American politics, prepared to break down one of the countless invisible barriers that divided their city's inhabitants. "Sir," Agent Morrison tried one last time, his voice carrying both warning and concern. But Barron had already made his decision. The veteran looked up again, his eyes now registering the full reality of who stood before him. Recognition flickered across his face, followed by confusion and something else. A mixture of shame and defiance that spoke of a man who had once stood proud in uniform, now forced to sit on frozen concrete. The wind gusted again, carrying with it the first few flakes of the approaching storm. They swirled around the small group, the teenage son of privilege, the struggling veteran, and the watchful agents, as New York City continued its relentless pace around them, unaware that something extraordinary was about to unfold in this ordinary doorway on an ordinary winter morning. A young woman hurried past, her heels clicking on the frozen sidewalk. She glanced at the scene, the tall teenager, the security detail, the trembling veteran, then quickly looked away, picking up her pace. It was such a New York moment. that it almost made Barron laugh. The studied indifference, the practiced art of not seeing. "Your hands are shaking pretty badly," Barron said softly, addressing the veteran directly for the first time. "May I sit with you for a moment?" Agent Morrison shifted his weight, uncomfortable with the situation but professional enough not to intervene again. He touched his earpiece, murmuring quietly into his radio. "Sunflower is stationary. Scene secure but fluid. Stand by." The veteran looked up at Barron, his eyes focusing and unfocusing as he fought to control his breathing. You shouldn't," he managed to say between gasps. "I'm not. This isn't. I'm Barron," he said simply, deliberately leaving off his last name, though they both knew it wasn't necessary. He glanced at the spilled coffee. "Would you like another cup? I happen to have an extra hot chocolate." The man's eyes darted between Barron and the agent's, understanding dawning on his weathered face. A flash of military bearing surfaced, his spine straightened slightly, shoulders squaring despite his seated position. "James Cooper," he said, his voice steadier for a moment. "Former Marine Corps, 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines." The formal introduction seemed to help ground him, giving him something familiar to hold on to. Barron carefully set down the drink carrier and, in a move that made Agent Chen take half a step forward, lowered himself to sit on the cold concrete beside James, maintaining a respectful distance but close enough to talk without raising his voice. "It's nice to meet you, Mr. Cooper," Barron said, reaching for one of the hot chocolates. "Would you like this? It's still warm." James stared at the offered cup, his hands still trembling. I might spill it again," he admitted, the shame evident in his voice. "Then we'll clean it up together," Barron replied simply. "No big deal." A woman pushing a stroller slowed as she passed, her eyes widening as she recognized Barron. She pulled out her phone, but one stern look from Agent Morrison sent her hurrying on her way. "They're going to take pictures," James said, his breathing still irregular but slightly calmer. "You shouldn't. Your father." "Let them," Barron shrugged, still holding out the hot chocolate. "Maybe it'll make other people stop and think next time they walk past someone who needs help." James slowly reached for the cup, his hands shaking less now that he had something to focus on. "Why?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why would you stop?" Barron was quiet for a moment, watching as more snowflakes began to fall around them. The wind had died down somewhat, as if nature itself was pausing to witness this unlikely encounter. "Because someone once told me that the measure of a person isn't in how they treat people who can help them, but in how they treat people who can't," he said finally. "And because I know what it's like when your mind becomes your enemy." James's hands tightened around the cup, knuckles white with the effort of keeping it steady. "You can't possibly know what that's like," Barron finished for him. "Maybe not exactly the same way you do, but I know what it's like to have panic attacks. To feel like you can't breathe. To have your whole body betray you while your mind races with thoughts you can't control." Above them, Agent Morrison shifted his position slightly, touched by the raw honesty in his protectee's voice. He'd been there for some of those panic attacks in the early days, had seen the toll that constant public scrutiny had taken on the then 13-year-old boy, but he'd never heard Barron speak about it so openly. "It was different after my 3rd tour," James said suddenly, as if the words were being pulled from him. "The first 2, I could handle those. But the 3rd. His voice cracked. "We were just doing a routine patrol, nothing special. Then the IED. I was the only one who—" He stopped, his breathing becoming erratic again. "You don't have to talk about it," Barron said quietly. "Not if you don't want to." A garbage truck rumbled past, its hydraulics hissing as it lifted a dumpster from a nearby alley. James flinched at the sound, some of the hot chocolate sloshing over the rim of his cup. "Sorry," he mumbled, trying to wipe it up with his sleeve. "Here." Barron pulled a clean napkin from his coat pocket. He'd grabbed extras at the coffee shop. "I'm kind of clumsy myself. Always good to be prepared." This small, normal interaction seemed to help steady James further. His hands still shook, but the violent trembling had subsided somewhat. "My wife tried to understand," he continued, staring into his cup. "She really did. But the nightmares. I'd wake up screaming, sometimes fighting. Once, He swallowed hard. "I thought she was an insurgent. Nearly hurt her before I realized. She left the next day. Can't blame her." Barron listened, really listened, as James spoke. not just to the words, but to the pain behind them. The snow was falling more heavily now, creating a sort of curtain around their little corner of New York, as if they were in their own private world. The VA. James gestured vaguely. They try, but there's so many of us, waiting lists for everything. Can't afford the private doctors. Lost my job when I couldn't, when the attacks got too bad. Then the apartment. Everything just. He made a falling motion with one hand. Agent Chen, who had been maintaining his professional distance, found himself blinking rapidly. His own father had served in Desert Storm, had struggled with similar demons. He'd been one of the lucky ones who got help in time. "Mr. Cooper," Barron said, his voice taking on a quiet determination. "I know it might not seem like it right now, but this moment, right here, this could be the day things start to change." James looked at him skeptically. "Why? Because you stopped to give me hot chocolate?" "No," Barron shook his head. "Because you're still here, still fighting, still trying, and now you're not fighting alone anymore." A tear rolled down James's weathered cheek, freezing halfway down in the bitter cold. He wiped it away roughly with the back of his hand. "I'm tired," he admitted, and something in the way he said it made it clear he wasn't just talking about physical exhaustion. So damn tired. Barron nodded, understanding far more than his 17 years might suggest. "I know. And that's okay. Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is admit when we need help." The snow was beginning to accumulate on the sidewalk now, creating a thin white blanket that muffled the city's usual cacophony. It felt almost peaceful in their little doorway, despite the circumstances that had brought them there. Agent Morrison checked his watch, knowing they'd been stationary far longer than protocol recommended, but something told him this wasn't the moment to intervene. Sometimes, he realized, security meant more than just physical protection. "Sir," James said suddenly, his military bearings surfacing again. "You should go. It's getting colder, and I've taken up too much of your time." Barron looked at him for a long moment, then pulled out his phone. "Actually, Mr. Cooper, if you're willing, I'd like to make a call first." This was the moment that would truly change everything, though neither of them knew it yet. As Barron's fingers hovered over his phone's screen, the snow continued to fall, and New York City held its breath, waiting to see what would happen next in this most unlikely of encounters. Chapter 2. Breaking Protocol. The snow was falling harder now, coating Fifth Avenue in a deceptive blanket of white that made everything look cleaner, softer, more forgiving. Barron's fingers hovered over his phone screen for a moment before he looked up at James. "There's a VA hospital 6 blocks from here," he said quietly. "Would you be willing to go there with me, right now?" James's face went through a complex series of emotions: hope, fear, resignation, and something else that might have been shame. "They're backed up," he started to explain, his voice rough. "Waiting lists. It's not that simple." Agent Morrison watched the exchange with growing interest. In 15 years of service, he'd seen all sorts of situations, but this was uncharted territory. His earpiece crackled with questions from the command center about their extended stay, but he held up a hand, signaling for patience. "I know it's not simple," Barron acknowledged, still holding his phone. "But what if we could make it simpler? Not because of who my father is," he added quickly, seeing James's expression, "but because it's the right thing to do. Because you've earned it." A taxi splashed through the slush nearby, sending up a spray that the wind carried just past them. James watched it disappear into the swirling snow before speaking again. "Why are you really doing this?" he asked, his voice barely audible above the city noise. "Is it some kind of photo op?" Barron actually laughed at that, though there was no mockery in it. "Mr. Cooper, if I wanted a photo op, I wouldn't be sitting on frozen concrete in the middle of a snowstorm. The press will probably find out anyway, but that's not why I'm here." Agent Chen shifted his position slightly, scanning the street. Already, a few pedestrians had slowed their pace, phones partially raised. It wouldn't be long before social media caught wind of the scene. "Sir," Morrison said quietly, "if we're going to move, we should do it soon." Barron nodded, then turned back to James. "The choice is yours, Mr. Cooper, but I want you to know something. Whatever you decide, you matter. Your life matters. What happened to you matters." James's hands had started trembling again, but differently now. He stared at them as if they belonged to someone else. I haven't. I haven't felt like I mattered in a long time, he admitted. Well, you do, Barron said simply. So what do you say? Will you let us help? A group of tourists passed by, speaking rapid Italian, their excitement at recognizing Barron clear in their animated gestures. Morrison and Chen smoothly repositioned themselves, creating a buffer between the tourists and the doorway. James watched this choreography with the trained eye of someone who understood tactical movements. Your security detail is probably having fits right now, he observed, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. They're professionals, Barron replied with a slight grin. They'll manage. Won't you, Agent Morrison? Morrison maintained his stern expression, but there was a warmth in his eyes as he responded. We adapt to the situation, sir. James looked between them, then down at his shabby clothes and worn boots. I'm not exactly presentable. Neither am I, Barron said, gesturing to his now damp pants from sitting on the concrete. Come on, Mr. Cooper, let's get out of this snow. For a long moment, James didn't move. His breathing had quickened again, but this time it seemed more from anticipation than panic. Finally, slowly, he nodded. Okay, he whispered, then cleared his throat and said more firmly, okay. Barron stood first, brushing off his pants, then extended his hand to James. The veteran stared at it for a moment, then reached up with a trembling hand to grasp it. The moment their hands connected, something passed between them. An understanding, a promise, a bridge across the vast divide that separated their worlds. With surprising strength, Barron helped James to his feet. Agent Morrison was already on his radio, coordinating with both the command center and the hospital. Sunflower, moving with one civilian. Need clearance for VA Medical Center, 6th and. Just a second, James said suddenly, turning back to gather his few possessions from the doorway. A worn backpack. A folded blanket. The cardboard sign he'd never actually held up. Leave it, Barron suggested gently. We'll get you what you need. James clutched the backpack tighter. My tags are in here, he explained. And pictures from before. Barron nodded, understanding. Of course, bring them. They made an unusual group as they started down Fifth Avenue. The tall teenager in his expensive coat, the weathered veteran with his military backpack, and the alert Secret Service agents maintaining their protective formation. The snow swirled around them, and passing New Yorkers did double takes at the sight. I might. James started, then stopped walking. I might panic again, in the hospital. Sometimes the smells, the sounds. Then we'll handle it, Barron said firmly. One step at a time, Mr. Cooper. They resumed walking, James's steps becoming steadier as they went. At one point, a delivery bike came too close, its wheels spraying slush. Without missing a beat, Agent Chen stepped between the spray and James, taking the brunt of it on his coat. Thank you, James said quietly, the military courtesy ingrained in him surfacing again. Chen just nodded, but there was respect in his eyes. He'd seen the Marine Corps tattoo on James's wrist, faded but still visible. As they walked, Barron kept up a gentle conversation, talking about neutral topics, the weather, the city, anything to keep James's mind occupied. He noticed how the veteran's eyes constantly scanned their surroundings, hyper-aware of every movement, every potential threat. Old habits, James muttered, catching Barron's observation. Can't turn it off anymore. Nothing wrong with being aware, Morrison commented, surprising them both. Just need to find a balance. A woman with a small dog approached from the opposite direction. The dog, a friendly golden retriever, strained at its leash, tail wagging. James tensed visibly. They used dogs, he said tightly. For eye detection. Tucker was. He was a good boy. Didn't deserve. Barron smoothly guided them to the other side of the sidewalk, giving the dog and its owner a wide berth. Tell me about Tucker, he suggested, recognizing James's need to talk. As they walked, James spoke about the bomb-sniffing dog who'd saved his unit multiple times, his voice growing stronger as he shared memories of better days. The snow continued to fall, but none of them really noticed anymore. They were halfway to the hospital when James stopped again, his breathing becoming more labored. I can't. What if they don't? They will, Barron assured him. And if they don't, we'll figure something else out. I promise you're not going back to that doorway. A news van turned onto the street ahead of them, its logo visible through the snow. Someone had obviously tipped them off. Great, Morrison muttered, touching his earpiece again. Sir, we should pick up the pace. But Barron's attention was on James, who had started trembling again, at the sight of the van. Hey, he said softly. Look at me, Mr. Cooper. Just focus right here. They don't matter. None of them matter right now. James met his eyes, finding an anchor in the teenager's steady gaze. You know what's funny? He said, his voice shaky but determined. My own kid would be about your age now. Haven't seen him since it all fell apart. The weight of that confession hung in the snowy air between them. Barron felt its impact like a physical thing. Maybe, he said carefully. That's something else we can work on. One step at a time, remember? James nodded, squaring his shoulders. They resumed walking, past the news van, past the gathering photographers, past the curious onlookers with their phones raised. The VA hospital loomed ahead of them now, its brick facade a darker shadow through the falling snow. James's steps slowed as they approached the entrance. I tried before, he admitted. 6 months ago. Saturday in the waiting room for 14 hours. Nobody could. There weren't any beds, they said. No space in the program. Barron's jaw set in a way that reminded Morrison eerily of the boy's father. That's not going to happen this time, he said, his voice carrying a quiet authority that belied his years. They reached the hospital entrance, its automatic doors whooshing open to release a blast of warm air. James stood frozen on the threshold, his whole body rigid with tension. Mr. Cooper, Barron said softly, you survived a war. You survived losing your team. You survived everything that came after. You can survive walking through this door. Agent Morrison found himself holding his breath, watching the internal battle play out on the veteran's face. In that moment, he understood something profound about courage. Sometimes the bravest acts weren't grand gestures on battlefields, but simple steps forward when everything in you wanted to run. James Cooper took a deep breath, clutched his backpack tighter, and walked through the door. Barron followed, close enough to offer support, but far enough to give the man his dignity. The lobby was busy with the controlled chaos, typical of hospitals. A security guard approached, probably alerted by Morrison's advance call, but stopped short when he recognized Barron. Welcome to the VA, he said instead, his eyes moving between Barron and James. How can we help you today? This was the moment, the point of no return. James's breathing had quickened again, his eyes darting between the exits. But before he could retreat, Barron spoke. My friend needs help, he said clearly, his voice carrying across the lobby. And we're not leaving until he gets it. The hospital lobby fell into an unusual quiet at Barron's words. A nurse at the intake desk looked up, her eyes widening slightly as she recognized him. Sir. The security guard started, clearly unsure of protocol in this situation. There's a proper procedure for. I understand, Barron interrupted politely but firmly. And we'll follow whatever procedures we need to. But Mr. Cooper needs help now, today. James stood rigid beside him, his military bearing warring with his obvious discomfort. The fluorescent lights seemed to emphasize every crease in his weathered face, every stain on his old jacket. Name? The intake nurse called out, her voice professional but kind. James Cooper, Barron answered when James seemed unable to speak. Former Marine Corps, 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines. The nurse's expression softened slightly. Her name tag read Patricia, and a small pin on her lapel showed she was a veteran herself. Mr. Cooper, she said, addressing him directly. Can you come to the desk, please? James's feet seemed rooted to the spot. His breathing had become shallow again, and his hands were starting to shake. The backpack strap was twisted so tightly in his grip that his knuckles had gone white. You've got this, Barron said quietly. Just a few more steps. A young resident hurried past with a clipboard, the movement making James flinch. Agent Morrison smoothly stepped between them, creating a buffer zone that seemed to help James regain his focus. I can't, James whispered, his voice cracking. All the paperwork. I don't have my records. My ID is expired. Then we'll figure it out together, Barron said. He glanced at Agent Morrison, who gave a subtle nod and touched his earpiece. already working on the documentation issue through his contacts. They made their way to the desk, where Patricia waited patiently. James's steps were unsteady, but he managed to reach the counter and brace himself against it. "I need to ask you some questions, Mr. Cooper," Patricia said gently. "Is that okay?" James nodded jerkily, his eyes fixed on the counter surface. "Are you having thoughts of harming yourself or others?" The question hung in the air for a long moment. James's breathing hitched and his grip on the counter tightened. "Sometimes," he admitted finally, his voice barely audible, "the memories, they get loud." Patricia nodded, making a note in her computer. "When was the last time you had medical care?" Six months ago. Emergency room. Different hospital." His words came out clipped, military brief. "Can you tell me what brought you in then?" James closed his eyes. "Panic attack. Bad one. Thought I was back there. Scared some people on the subway." Barron listened, his heart heavy but his resolve strengthening. This was why he couldn't just walk past that doorway. This was why they were here. "Current medications?" "None. Can't. Couldn't afford." James's voice trailed off. Patricia looked up at him directly. "Mr. Cooper, are you currently homeless?" The question seemed to hit James like a physical blow. His shoulders hunched, and for a moment, Barron thought he might bolt. But then, something remarkable happened. "Yes," James said clearly, lifting his chin slightly. "But I want to get better. I need help." The admission seemed to cost him tremendously, but it also seemed to lift something from him. His breathing steadied slightly. Patricia typed something into her computer, then picked up her phone. "Dr. Martinez, can you come to intake?" "Yes, now please." While they waited, James suddenly turned to Barron. "You don't have to stay," he said. "You've already done more than." "I'm staying," Barron said simply. "Unless you want me to leave?" James shook his head, then seemed embarrassed by how quickly he'd responded. A doctor appeared, his white coat crisp despite the late hour. He took in the scene, the Secret Service agents, Barron Trump, and the trembling veteran, with remarkable composure. "Mr. Cooper," he said warmly. "I'm Dr. Martinez. Patricia tells me you're having a rough time." James straightened instinctively at the direct address. "Yes, sir? Would you be willing to talk with me for a few minutes? We have a quieter room where we can chat." James's eyes darted to Barron, then back to the doctor. The waiting list," they said last time. Dr. Martinez's expression softened. "Let's just talk first, okay? One step at a time." That phrase again, James seemed to draw strength from it. He nodded. "Young man," Dr. Martinez said, turning to Barron, "thank you for bringing Mr. Cooper to us. We'll take good care of him." Barron stepped forward slightly. "Doctor, I'd like to stay, at least until Mr. Cooper is settled, if that's okay with him." Dr. Martinez looked at James, who nodded again, more firmly this time. "Very well," the doctor said. "Follow me, please." As they walked down the corridor, Agent Morrison coordinated with hospital security, establishing safe routes and checking sightlines. It was far from standard procedure. But then again, nothing about this day had been standard. The consultation room was small but comfortable, with soft lighting that felt easier on the eyes than the harsh fluorescence of the lobby. James sank into one of the chairs, his exhaustion finally showing through his military bearing. "Mr. Cooper," Dr. Martinez began, his voice gentle but professional, "can you tell me what brought you here today?" James looked at Barron, then back at the doctor. He took a deep breath and began to tell his story. The fluorescent lights of the VA hospital corridor hummed softly as Agent Steve Morrison stood outside the examination room, performing his routine security check. Inside, James Cooper was undergoing his initial medical evaluation. The winter storm had intensified outside, turning the hospital windows into blurry sheets of white. "Base, this is Echo 1. Morrison spoke quietly into his wrist mic. "Situation stable. Anticipate another hour on site." "Copy that, Echo 1. The response crackled back. "Press presence increasing at main entrance." Morrison sighed, watching Barron pace the hallway. In 15 years of service, he'd witnessed countless publicity events, staged photo ops, and carefully managed public appearances. But this was different. The examination room door opened, and Dr. Martinez emerged, his expression thoughtful. "How is he?" Barron asked immediately, stopping his pacing. Better than expected, given his conditions, the doctor replied. Some frostbite on his extremities, mild hypothermia, malnutrition, all treatable. The bigger challenges. His PTSD, Barron finished. Dr. Martinez nodded. We're admitting him to our intensive treatment program. He'll have housing here while we help him get back on his feet. A nurse hurried past with fresh linens, offering a small smile. The regular rhythms of hospital life continued around them. Call buttons chiming, phones ringing, the squeak of comfortable shoes on polished floors. You know this will be in the press by morning? Morrison said, his voice gruff with suppressed emotion. He held up his phone, showing several news alerts already popping up. Barron's face hardened slightly. I don't care about that. What I care about is that Mr. Cooper gets the help he needs. He's earned it. The examination room door opened again, and James appeared in a wheelchair, now dressed in clean hospital clothes. The tremor in his hands had subsided somewhat, though his eyes still darted nervously around the corridor. They want to run some more tests, he said, his voice stronger than before. Blood work, they said, and something about a trauma assessment. Standard procedure, Dr. Martinez assured him. We need to establish baselines so we can track your progress. James nodded, then looked up at Barron. You should go. You've already done more than enough. Actually, Barron replied, if it's okay with you, I'd like to stay until you're settled. The veteran's eyes widened slightly. Why? He asked, genuine confusion in his voice. Why do you care so much? Barron was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. Because someone once told me that the measure of a person isn't in how they treat people who can help them, but in how they treat people who can't. And because what happened to you, what happened to your team, matters. You matter. Morrison turned away, pretending to check the corridor while he composed himself. In all his years of service, he'd never been so moved by a simple conversation. The nurse wheeled James toward the elevator, heading for the inpatient ward. Before they reached it, James called out, Barron? Yes? Thank you, James said, his voice breaking slightly. For seeing me. Really seeing me. The elevator doors closed, and for a moment, the corridor was silent except for the eternal hum of hospital machinery. Sir, Morrison said finally, we should think about heading out. The storm's getting worse, and the press. Just a few more minutes, Barron interrupted gently. I want to make sure everything's properly arranged. They made their way to the nurse's station, where the head nurse, Sandra, was reviewing admission papers. Mr. Trump, she said warmly, I wanted to thank you. What you did today, it means more than you know. I didn't do anything special, Barron protested. Sandra shook her head. You stopped. Do you know how many people walk past our veterans every day? How many look right through them? You stopped, and that made all the difference. A commotion at the end of the hall drew their attention. James was refusing to get into bed, his anxiety visibly rising. I can't, they heard him saying. The windows. I need to see the exits. Without hesitation, Barron walked toward the room, Morrison following close behind. Mr. Cooper, Barron said softly from the doorway. May I come in? James looked up, his military bearing warring with his obvious distress. I'm sorry, I'm being difficult. No, Barron said firmly. You're being human, and that's okay. He turned to the nurse. Could we move the bed so Mr. Cooper can see the door? The small adjustment seemed to help. James's breathing steadied as he sat on the edge of the bed, now positioned with clear sight lines to both the door and window. I keep thinking this isn't real, James admitted quietly. That I'll wake up back in that doorway. It's real, Barron assured him, and you're not going back there, ever. Morrison watched from the doorway, remembering his own father's struggles after Vietnam. Some battles, he knew, didn't end when the shooting stopped. As evening approached, the hospital settled into its night routine. James had finally fallen asleep, exhausted from the day's events. Barron stood at the window, watching the snow fall. Sir, Morrison said gently, we really should go. Barron nodded, but first pulled something from his pocket. James's worn leather wallet, which he'd been safeguarding. Could you make sure this gets stored securely? He asked Sandra. His military tags are in here. And pictures of his son, they're very important to him. Of course, Sandra promised. We'll keep them safe until he's ready for them. As they prepared to leave, Dr. Martinez approached with some papers. "I thought you should know," he said quietly. "Mr. Cooper has agreed to let us contact his son. It's a small step, but—" "An important one," Barron finished. They made their way through the hospital's quiet corridors, passing the small chapel where an elderly veteran sat in silent prayer. Outside, the storm had transformed New York into a winter wonderland, muffling the usual city sounds. "You did a good thing today, sir," Morrison said as they reached the car. Barron looked back at the hospital windows. "I just hope it's enough." "Sometimes," Morrison replied, his voice thick with emotion, "enough is just showing someone they matter." Later that night, as Morrison filed his daily report, he had to stop several times to wipe his eyes. In the official document, he wrote simply, "The protectee demonstrated exceptional compassion while maintaining appropriate security awareness." But in his personal journal, he wrote something else. "Today I watched a young man prove that sometimes the greatest act of patriotism is simply stopping to help another human being." The story made the news, despite Barron's attempts to keep it quiet. Headlines ranged from sympathetic to cynical, as they always did. But what wasn't reported, what couldn't be captured in headlines or sound bites, was what happened in the months that followed. They didn't report how Barron continued to visit James throughout his treatment, always accompanied by Agent Morrison, who volunteered for those shifts without fail. They didn't write about the day James received his first letter from his son, or how Barron sat with him while he gathered the courage to read it. 6 months later, James stood in front of a room full of other veterans, accepting his certification as a peer counselor. His hands were steady as he held the certificate, and his eyes were clear and focused. And if anyone noticed that Agent Morrison always volunteered for shifts when Barron made his hospital visits, well, that was just a coincidence. At least, that's what he told himself as he discreetly wiped his eyes during James's graduation ceremony. But then again, some stories don't need headlines to be true. Some moments of grace speak for themselves. And sometimes, the greatest acts of heroism aren't the ones that make the news, but the simple choice to stop, to see, and to care. Because in the end, that's all it takes to change a life. One person willing to stop, to look past the surface, and to remind someone that they matter.